Everyone kind of has their own definition of emo music. For example, if I say emo music, you might be thinking about dark, edgy SoundCloud rap made by dudes with face tats, or you might be thinking of these beautiful, mathy guitar riffs that Giga Chads listen to in the gym, or you might be thinking about whatever the vibe of this picture is. The word emo as a musical term to describe a genre is one of the most used terms in the past 45 years. The word being used to describe a plethora of different types of artists, sounds, and scenes. And while we can all probably point to a handful of artists that we would describe as emo, it's hard to understand what exactly emo is. Because the truth of the matter is, not all of these things can be emo. So then what is real emo music? The truth is that emo is really a very specific genre of music. And it's probably not the type of music you think. The real, original emo actually almost completely died out as a genre at one point. But then the internet saved it. So what is real emo music, and how was it saved by the internet? If you're like me, you probably love to learn about music and other creative endeavors, which is why I want to talk about the sponsor of today's video, Skillshare. I personally know a lot about the history side of music, but I have always wanted to get better at my actual guitar skills and understanding more about music theory. And with the classes and learning paths on Skillshare, I've been able to dive in and start to learn more about these topics. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes, led by industry experts across film, illustration, design, freelance, productivity, and more. Skillshare can help you take your career, skills, hobbies, passions, or side hustles to the next level. While Skillshare has helped me with my hobby of learning the guitar, I can shred like my favorite bands, but Skillshare also has a lot of great learning paths on photography, videography, graphic design, so you can level up your visual game as well. There are also a lot of really valuable business and marketing classes that have helped me learn to market myself and progress in my career. And the great thing is that Skillshare has just added a ton of new classes specifically for creative careers and creative inspiration. So whether I've just wanted to get better at guitar so I can jam more with my bros, or if I've needed help leveling up my marketing skills for my online business, Skillshare has been there to help me succeed. So thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. The first 500 people who use my link in the description will also get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today. And what real emo music is, we have to go all the way back to the 1980s, to the hardcore punk scene of the East Coast. Punk rock, and specifically hardcore punk, had been around for a while at this point. While originally punk and hardcore music felt like a hub for creativity and expression, by the mid-1980s there was this sense of creative stagnation. While many people still appreciated hardcore punk for its aggressive, experimental, fast and loud sound, it became clear that thematically and lyrically it was becoming really repetitive. To be a hardcore punk song, your lyrics had to be very simple, angry, and nihilistic. The genre was not also known to be filled with many Shakespeares per se, in that a lot of the songwriting was pretty basic. Hardcore punk was kind of giving off this energy of that all of the songs sounded like they were written by a deeply jaded village oaf who had probably at one point or another picked up a copy of Das Kapital but didn't really know what it meant. Which brings us to Washington, D.C., particularly a band that was starting up called Rites of Spring. Guy Picciotto, the lead singer of Rites of Spring, still really loved hardcore music, but he wanted to write more meaningful and interesting lyrics that weren't just angry but touched on a variety of emotions. And also a variety of different subject matter, not just anarchy and nihilism and social unrest. You see, Guy had graduated with an English degree and he was keen on putting that to good use. He was more inspired by literature and poetry. He wanted to bring a more mature approach to his writing. And so with Guy at the helm, Rites of Spring began creating this new breed of hardcore music. For sure, there were times where Rites of Spring was definitely angry, but there were also times where they were hopeful, melancholic, fun, and many times just very beautiful. Guy had a very beautiful way of writing to describe this very rich subject matter, which often included these very original metaphors. Nice job letting that English degree not go to waste. And Rites of Spring was getting attention for this in Washington, D.C., specifically from the person who produced their music, Ian MacKaye. MacKaye had previously been in one of the most popular hardcore bands, Minor Threat. But Minor Threat had now broken up and he was looking to start a new project. And deeply inspired by Rites of Spring and Guy's writing style, he started the band Embrace. And he began writing his lyrical content more in the style of Guy's. Rites of Spring and Embrace began spreading their own version of hardcore across the East Coast. And soon in the Maryland, Annapolis, Baltimore, DC area, more and more bands began to pick up on this, to the point where Thrasher magazine began to take notice of this new subgenre of hardcore that was being formed. And they decided to give it a name. They termed it emotional hardcore, or emo, or emo-core for short. And this was the first description in writing of the word emo. Ian MacKaye of Embrace, upon hearing that his style of music was being referred to as emo or emo-core, was quoted on saying that it was the stupidest fucking thing he had ever heard. While the name emo or emotional hardcore did sort of accurately describe how these bands conveyed a wider range of emotions, Guy and Ian MacKaye probably would have been more excited if the name referred to the more literary or poetic structures of their writing, rather than just the emotional aspects. But they weren't the only ones on the East Coast in the DC area to start making music like this. Other groups like The Hated, Moss Icon, and Dag Nasty also started making music that fell under the emotional hardcore label. All these different bands were making music that were under the sonic structures of hardcore, but had writing sensibilities that were more in line with Leonard Cohen, Lou Reed, or Morrissey, rather than a Joey Ramone. Morrissey and the Smiths seem to have a particular influence on this scene, at least in a writing sense. Certain elements of how Morrissey writes, such as his very rich, grandiose descriptions, heavy literary and historical references, all really influenced emo music of this time. These bands are what we would call the first wave of emo, or the original emo bands. It's important to note that this first wave of emo bands all really came out of the same area. While this scene thrived and got a lot of traction in the 80s, by the 90s it would sort of die out. But the records they had produced and the style these bands had pioneered would live on and go on to influence different scenes across the United States. Which brings us to the 90s and the so-called second wave of emo. The second wave of emo is where emo music really developed strongly as a genre, rather than just a small regional scene. Like I said earlier, the music of the first wave would slowly spread across the United States and inspire countless other acts. As emo music sort of swept through the United States, it also began to evolve and take on some new qualities. While emo definitely was still very adjacent and similar to hardcore punk, it also began taking on some qualities from the rising indie music scene. Emo acts of this time were particularly inspired by the twinkling guitar sound that bands like Pavement or Guided by Voices used. And so they began incorporating this type of guitar sound alongside and in between more overdriven, aggressive hardcore punk sound.
Close my eyes, pull my heartstrings, pour my tears from your hand.
Emo acts in the second wave were also more conscious of being a little bit more melodic and catchy in their songwriting. And so you just really saw in the second wave of emo, it not just being emotional hardcore, but having this heavy indie music influence. Some of the standout acts during the second wave included bands like Sunny Day Real Estate, Mineral, Jawbreaker, and Jimmy Eat World. And these bands really brought emo to a different level of prominence. Sunny Day Real Estate, for example, became sort of an underground alternative rising star. While they weren't mainstream, they were definitely one of the more popular acts in the underground, and they even had some crossover on MTV. While Jawbreaker also became really huge in an underground sense. They had a huge cult following and even toured with Nirvana. While emo was certainly not mainstream at this point, it became a movement beyond a local scene and became defined as a genre. There were now a lot of different little scenes of emo and little pockets of it all across the United States. And some of these pockets or scenes of emo had sort of their own unique takes or sensibilities, such as Midwest emo. But what made it different from sort of the other parts of emo is that it leaned a little bit more into the indie guitar sound. Midwest emo was a little bit softer than the other counterparts across the United States. While it didn't shy away from the hardcore elements in any sense, there is a sense where Midwest emo was a little bit brighter, warmer, or homier. And Midwest emo is where you saw the sort of traditional emo voice get formed. The one that we kind of think of today as the genre cliche. Some notable acts from the Midwest emo scene in the second wave include Cap and Jazz, Promise Ring, Get Up Kids, Braid, and while at the time it wasn't super popular, we all know it today, American Football. The cool thing about Midwest emo too is that it sort of incorporated other elements from other genres, such as post-rock or math rock. Much of this was also influenced by the band Slint. While Midwest emo was sort of the lighter side of emo, if we're to go to the exact opposite side, in Southern California, a totally different side of emo developed and was evolved to, instead of being more softer, to be more aggressive and loud. Scrams, otherwise known as Screamo, looked back at the original emo bands like Embrace, Rites of Spring, and particularly Mott's Icon, and concentrated on evolving more towards the aggressive sensibilities of those bands. So Scrams was much louder, more violent, and was recognizable by its screamed vocals, which is actually how it got its original name, Screamo. Besides its sounding a little bit different from the rest of the emo scene, especially the Midwest emo, it was also a little bit lyrically different. Where Midwest emo, its subject matter and lyric-wise, was sort of more tender, endearing, personal. Scram's music leaned more into the literary or intellectual side of the emo roots. Scram's bands looked at how the first wave wrote their music, how they reference history, philosophy, obscure political ideology. First time you listen to Scrams, you probably wouldn't notice it, but the lyrics tend to be quite poetic, eloquent. But Scrams wasn't all just aggressive screaming and guitar shredding. Like the rest of the bands in the second wave of emo, they were also influenced by indie music. A lot of the bands had those twinkling, beautiful guitars. For example, Seisha, Indian Summer, and Joshua Fit for Battle all had those beautiful twinkling guitar melodies next to aggressive screaming. Some staples Scrams bands include Orchid, Seisha, Page 99, I Hate Myself, Jerome's Dream, Joshua Fit for Battle, City of the Caterpillar, and Codon Armada. In many ways, if we're to look at the second wave of emo, Scrams definitely is the more natural progression from the first wave to the second wave. And because of that, at the time in the whole second wave of emo, there was some infighting. But in my opinion, everything in the second wave was real emo music. Regardless of the small differences, all these bands really embody the same ethos, and they all can pretty easily be pointed back towards the same influences, just maybe at different ends of the spectrum. This second era in the 90s is where emo thrived. It had a specific underground scene, and it had a pretty specific sound. If you were to argue what real emo is, the second wave is arguably it. But that brings us into the 2000s, into what is often referred to as the third wave of emo. This is where things become complicated. One of these bands who had pretty good success in the 90s was Jimmy Eat World. Jimmy Eat World, like Sunny Day Real Estate, had had some pretty good success, and a lot of that was due to their more melodic or catchy sensibilities. As Jimmy Eat World fundamentally wrote songs differently than the rest of the emo scene, because they blended another genre with emo, pop punk. Jimmy Eat World's 1999 album, Clarity, had some really good underground success. And so then when they released their 2001 album, Bleed American, their success went on a completely different level. The album had multiple top 100 hits, including their single The Middle, which reached number 5 on the Billboard. The Middle is arguably one of the most recognizable songs of the 2000s. And Jimmy Eat World's emo pop punk fusion was not only unique, arguably a little bit more digestible than the rest of pop punk. When record labels saw how successful Jimmy Eat World was, they began to see dollar signs in the word emo. They wanted to find more bands like Jimmy Eat World, because while pop punk was great and rising in popularity and was definitely a moneymaker, it had a specific attitude that was limited. And that sort of attitude of pop punk at the time could sort of be boiled down to like a banana riding a skateboard with cool sunglasses. And what made Jimmy Eat World so profitable and them to see so much potential for profit is that Jimmy Eat World went beyond the rebellious skater archetype and sort of had a variety of emotions or people it could appeal to. Soon the record labels began stacking their roster with bands like Jimmy Eat World. However, like I said earlier, Jimmy Eat World was a pretty unique emo act because 90% of emo bands were nowhere near as catchy or marketable as Jimmy Eat World. So instead, record labels began finding pop punk bands that were less rooted in traditional punk or skater culture and sort of began grooming them into their own separate thing. And at this point, you might be wondering, are they replacing my hardcore with indie sensibilities and introspective writing, and instead just giving me a slightly angstier pop punk? And the answer would be yes. Looking back at it, years later, record labels would pretty much admit that they were just really looking for pop punk bands to market as emo to the mainstream. Out of the whole genre of emo that thrived before, very little of it influenced the emo that got a lot of funding from the record labels, and that was pushed onto the mainstream. Pretty much the term emo was taken, and they manufactured a kind of completely new genre around the term. It's very much a ship of thesis moment. It was really just another way to repackage pop punk music that was particularly a little bit sadder or angstier, because sad and angsty music tends to do well with a teenage audience. And this was not only profitable for record labels, but also clothing manufacturers. Because if you can create a whole new subculture, that's a whole new market. So the record labels started to sort of groom the bands that were on their rosters to have something called the emo look, where they gave them very specific haircuts, specific cuts of jeans, painted nails, all these sort of elements that were taken from goth culture. And it was just very, very profitable. It sold lots of records. It sold lots of clothes. It was one of the very rare times where you could sell makeup to men, and whenever you can do that, it's very, very profitable and very, very rare. And all of this not only gave the new emo of the 2000s in this third wave a very specific sound, but also a very specific look. And it's kind of funny, because if you look back at everything from the first and second wave, the people making emo music before just kind of looked like regular dudes. See, look, normal dudes. Normal dudes. And all of a sudden we got some completely different thing going on. And it's also just a shame. A lot of the manufactured emo bands had this sort of weird, pervy, lyrical energy that just kind of came off as creepy a lot of times. By around 2006, a lot of the most popular manufactured emo acts didn't even really have any punk or hardcore elements to them, and were pretty much just pop punk vocals over either Baroque pop instrumentals or like this sort of like bombastic classic rock. And look, I can't be too much of a hater at this, because in many ways there were a lot of very talented acts in manufactured emo. Hayley Williams and Paramore are amazing, but we have to get to the point here. This was definitely a definitive hijacking of the term emo from the second to the third wave that brought us into this huge ship of thesis moment, where emo in 1999 in most people's heads is completely different from the emo that is in 2006. This third wave of manufactured emo music pushed by the record labels is not emo music. Emo as a word became so popular during this era because so much money was put into making sure the term was culturally relevant. The word emo is now a synonym for being sad, because a lot of the emo acts were sad and angsty all the time. Because the word emo was pretty much used to describe two completely different genres, it created a lot of different confusion. And ultimately, the genre with the money behind it started overshadowing the original genre. It became harder to promote shows, to promote their music, especially on the early internet, because being able to describe your genre is super, super important. And while emo music in the original definition of the word didn't just disappear overnight, it definitely became overshadowed. From around 2000 to 2010, While there were great emo bands making real emo music, nobody really discovered them, and they weren't ever really talked about in a significant way. But as the internet became more fleshed out, one band actually had a bit of resurgence around 2009 to 2011. This band was from the early emo days. The band was American Football, which started gaining popularity in the 2010s. American Football, when it was originally active in the 90s, was not very popular in the emo scene. But on the internet, particularly with college-aged music nerds, people started really latching on to the album. It became a hipster specialty, if you will. American Football quickly gained a cult following in internet music circles that eventually translated into more people being interested in not only Midwest emo, but math rock fusion Midwest emo. Led to real music being made inspired by it, and something we would call the Midwest emo revival, otherwise called the fourth wave of emo. Except the thing about Midwest emo revival is that most of the bands making Midwest emo weren't from the Midwest, but were actually from New Jersey and Philly. And it quickly became a creative and thriving underground scene. You had bands like Tiger, Title Fight, Snowing, Modern Baseball, Joyce Manor, Boxing, The World is a Beautiful Place and I'm No Longer Afraid to Die, It Looks Sad, Panucci's Pizza, Marietta, and Pine Grove. All these bands started making this new version of Midwest emo. These bands specifically dug really deep into the more warm, friendlier, and homier, almost nostalgic elements of Midwest emo. For example, a lot of those twinkling guitar, the introspective, nostalgic lyrics, and then of course a lot of the math rock elements from American Football. A lot of the fourth wave emo revival is notably slightly less edgy or aggressive or moody than even the original Midwest emo sound. And I think a big reason for this was wanting to separate from the angst that had become associated with the term emo because of the manufactured pop punk emo bands of the 2000s. Fourth wave emo really scrubbed itself of almost any elements that could clearly associate it or put it close to the pop punk emo of the 2000s. Instead, Midwest emo revival, or the fourth wave of emo, took cultural cues from indie music, bedroom pop, and the alternative rock of the time. Nobody dressed in the sort of 2000s edgy way. Instead, everybody sort of looked more reminiscent of like a Mac DeMarco. For example, a lot of the bands I just mentioned that were super notable Midwest emo revival bands played the same underground venues or house shows, and even toured with the likes of artists like Alex G or Teen Suicide. But I want to make something very clear. This Midwest emo revival was not super big at the time. It really didn't shift the public's general perception or understanding of what emo or emo music was. The fourth wave of emo, or Midwest emo, was a very specific take on emo music. Midwest emo revival was Midwest emo, but made even softer for the most part, and replacing a lot of the more hardcore aggressive elements of the original Midwest emo, oftentimes with different elements such as math rock or shoegaze. The Midwest emo revival, or fourth wave of emo, wasn't a revival of the original emo sound as a whole, but rather a very specific take on a microgenre. And I guess that's why it's called Midwest emo revival and not emo revival. And by the tail end of the 2010s, specifically around 2018 and 2020, a lot of these bands started to break up or went on hiatus or stopped touring, and all of a sudden you saw this underground scene slowly kind of fade out. Title Fight, Pine Grove, Marietta, Snowing. A lot of these bands were no longer active in a significant way that they had been through most of the 2010s. And before you know it, the fourth wave was kind of over. That is in a musical output or touring sense. Because just as soon as it ended, it felt like Midwest emo revival music in 2 or 3 years after started getting huge on TikTok. A lot of the younger generation, who probably couldn't even see a lot of these shows, started discovering Midwest emo and Midwest emo revival in a very significant way. And all of a sudden, a lot of these Midwest emo and Midwest emo revival bands went from being sort of underground with critical acclaim to sort of being staple music for Gen Z. Title Fight, Pine Grove, Basement all blew up on TikTok. American football became one of the seminal sort of musical memes. And sort of Midwest emo and Midwest emo revival very much was claimed as part of the soundtrack for Gen Z. And the reach of Midwest emo is just massive. Absolutely huge compared to where it was in the 2010s. On a completely separate note, there also began to be significant efforts to digitize and publish a lot of the music from the first and second wave of emo. When the Midwest emo revival happened, a lot of people went to go dig back and take a look at the original Midwest emo and original emo music. And what people found is that a lot of the music from the first and second wave had not been officially published online or put on streaming. And so a lot of it had fallen under the rug in a very significant way. And there were acts that were really popular in the first and second wave scenes that were nowhere to be really found on the internet, besides YouTube bootlegs. And I'm talking pretty big bands like The Hated, Seisha, Indian Summer, Page 99, Jerome's Dream, either had huge pieces of their musical catalog missing or were not on streaming services at all. So record labels like Numero Group began the work on not only reissuing these bands and making their music more readily available to the public, but also working on massive campaigns to re-educate people, particularly the music of the first and second wave of emo. They also began taking the time to work on reissuing smaller bands as well. Bands that were making real emo music during the 2000s. And so all of a sudden you saw these bands from the 2000s, which were making real emo music, starting to get attention online. Some examples of these bands from this era, which were kind of lost and overshadowed by emo pop punk, include Everyone Asked About You, Merchant Ships, 125 Rue Montremer, Brave Little Abacus, Audience of One, The Pine, Newfound Interest in Connecticut. These bands started getting more and more popular and gaining cult followings throughout the late 2010s and into the early 2020s. And so while Midwest emo was going viral on TikTok, the original sounds of the first and second wave and the previously undiscovered acts of the 2000s were becoming more and more popular in underground music circles, because for many younger people, they could discover them naturally. And by the time you get to the early 2020s, you're starting to see more and more acts that sound like the original emo music. You have bands like Versus Self, Mitsubishi Suicide, Summer 2000, February, Burial Etiquette, Window Dusk, Seahorse Choke, that have all been reviving the original sound of emo. And they're not just taking notes from Midwest emo. They're taking notes from Scram's acts like Seisha or Indian Summer. These bands in the early 2020s are really starting to encompass the original sound of emo and really helping to reestablish the term and making it more connected with the original genre of music. And this new generation of emo music that's really reviving the original sound is also becoming surprisingly popular on TikTok. Versus Self has had a lot of success getting out of alternative circles and into more mainstream audiences as well. So has some of the more popular reissues like Everyone Asked About You or Merchant Ship. For some reason, this fifth wave or new era of emo revival has been really popular with gym bros. And for the first time, basically in 20 years, the word emo isn't being associated with that angsty pop punk subculture, but instead with the actual music that started it all. The music that really resonated with people in the first place is actually starting to win. And I think it's a really cool story how the internet and sort of individuals kind of saved this genre of music. If you liked this video, give me a follow, like, subscribe. My name is Karsten Craning, and thank you so much for watching.